Thanks for watching Endgame Economics. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe. It's completely free for you, and it helps us continue making more videos like this.
Look at this topographical map of the United States. Most great American cities make geographical sense. They sit on coasts, deep water harbors, or navigable rivers that naturally drive trade. Dallas is isolated in the middle of a flat, landlocked prairie in North Texas. It has no ocean, no mountains, and its only river, the Trinity, is a flood-prone, silt-choked stream you can barely float a boat down. Yet today, that muddy riverbank is the fourth largest metro area in the country. It recently surpassed California and New York as the state with the most Fortune 500 headquarters, pulling in corporate giants from across the globe. Looking at a map, Dallas is the kid who shows up to the party nobody invited them to, and somehow ends up owning the house. It is a metropolis that exists not because of geography, but through a series of manufactured victories. Take the railroad heist of 1871. When trains planned to bypass the town, local leaders paid a $5,000 bribe to shift the route. Then they slipped last-minute legislation into the state government, forcing a second rail line to cross at a secret location called Browder Springs. Unbeknownst to the competition, Browder Springs was actually Dallas. By 1880, the population had more than tripled, purely because of that crossroads. Locals eventually turned this history into a kind of civic religion, a belief that since the city was willed into being out of nothing, its future depends on that same relentless performance of ambition and success. To manage that performance, the city handed the reins to a very specific group of people. In the 1930s, a secretive organization called the Dallas Citizens Council took control. Membership was restricted to CEOs and bank presidents, men who could commit their company's money on the spot. They restructured the local government, replacing the political system with a city manager who answered to the mayor and council, effectively running the municipality like a corporation. These decision-makers wanted a clean, cosmopolitan brand to attract outside money. They poured funding into street grids, sewer systems, and gleaming towers. But to maintain that investor-friendly sheen, they actively suppressed anything that might look like turbulence. Racial tensions and labor disputes were often hushed or papered over because they were bad for the brand. This efficiency came with a long-term side effect. For decades, political networks remained sparse, and voter turnout stayed among the lowest in the country. When a city is run like a company for so long, the public begins to believe their participation is irrelevant, a state of civic disengagement that persists long after the boardrooms change. Managing a city primarily for its image creates a dangerous reflex. Instead of confronting underlying social rot, the priority becomes burying any embarrassing truths that might crack the pristine facade. By the early 1960s, that reflex failed. A severe, far-right political fever had taken root, boiling over in highly public ways. Prominent figures like Senator Lyndon B. Johnson and UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson were spat on and jostled by mobs right in the middle of town. That political climate culminated on November 22, 1963. Hours after seeing handbills circulating town accusing him of treason, President John F. Kennedy was dead. Even though the shooter was a self-styled Marxist and not part of the local political establishment, the global public rendered a brutal verdict. Overnight, it was branded the City of Hate. Faced with this public shame, the city relied on its oldest instinct. When officials finally approved a Kennedy memorial, they placed it 2 blocks away from Dealey Plaza, tucked out of sight. They even resisted building a museum at the assassination site for years, choosing to physically and geographically hide the wound. The culture proved it would rather construct a dozen gleaming new skyscrapers and look forward than do the heavy, uncomfortable work of grieving backward. To escape that toxic 1960s reputation, the city eventually grabbed onto a lifeline from Hollywood. In the late 70s, a soap opera about a fabulously wealthy, scheming oil family became a global phenomenon. Instead of rejecting the ruthless caricature, locals leaned in. They eagerly adopted the identity of J.R. Ewing, a culture of conspicuous consumption and the unapologetic performance of wealth. That cultural obsession with outward success eventually found its way into theology. Today, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex is the absolute epicenter of the American megachurch movement, home to religious institutions with weekly attendances that rival major sporting events. Many of these enormous congregations preach the prosperity gospel, a theology teaching that strong belief and financial giving will be rewarded by God with material abundance. It is the exact same operating system as the secular founding myth of the city. You start with nothing, and through sheer audacity and faith, you summon prosperity out of the empty prairie. Whether you're buying luxury goods or tithing in massive sanctuaries, the underlying drive is identical. Relentlessly projecting abundance acts as the ultimate shield against the anxiety that your foundation might not be as solid as it looks. The obsession with projecting success left a physical scar on the map, an invisible wall partitioning the affluent North from the neglected South. Southern Dallas contains nearly half the population, larger than Atlanta, yet holds a tiny fraction of the tax base. This divide is not the result of natural market forces. It was engineered. City planners used government redlining maps to mark minority neighborhoods as hazardous, starving them of investment. When urban renewal arrived, they actively bulldozed thriving minority districts to construct massive highway interchanges, turning these concrete overpasses into permanent, physical barriers of segregation. The same corporate ruthlessness that efficiently built the shiny tax base in the North was actively deployed south of the river, literally bulldozing communities in order to hide the city's most vulnerable populations. We can see the culmination of this mentality in the current corporate boom. The metro area is pulling in hundreds of new headquarters and trillions in revenue. But that dazzling economic energy is almost entirely flooding into the affluent northern suburbs. The latest census data exposes the hidden consequence of this uneven growth. While the wider region is exploding, the actual city proper is leaking residents. The urban core is losing people to its prosperous outer rings. Sheer willpower is a morally neutral force. It has the power to conjure glass towers from the dirt, but it builds invisible walls of segregation with equal enthusiasm. The ultimate test for this booming metropolis isn't whether it can attract another corporate headquarters. It is whether it has the courage to point its relentless ambition at the foundational cracks it has spent a century trying to hide.